Hello, peeps. I saw that in the chat. What in the world is the reading gun? I'm not going to get an answer for a while. But anyways, so we are returning back to the Narnia series. We are currently on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the second in the chronological order, not of production, but of in world story. So they were on a green open space from which you could look down on the forest, spreading as far as one could see in every direction, except right ahead. There, far to the east, was something twinkling and moving. By gum, whispered Peter to Susan. See! In the very middle of this open hilltop was the stone table. It was a great grim slab of grey stone, supported on 4 upright stones. It looked very old, and it was cut all over with strange lines and figures that might be the letters of an unknown language. They gave you a curious feeling when you looked at them. The next thing they saw was a pavilion pitched on one side of the open place. A wonderful pavilion it was, and especially now, when the light of the setting sun fell upon it, with sides of which looked like yellow silk and cords of crimson and tent pegs of ivory. And high above it, on a pole, a banner which bore a red rampant lion fluttering in the breeze which was blowing in their faces from the far-off sea. While they were looking at this, they heard a sound of music on their right, and turning in that direction, they saw what they had come to see. Aslan stood in the center of a crowd of creatures who had grouped themselves round him in the shape of a half-moon. There were tree women there, and well women, dryads and naiads as they used to be called in our world, who had stringed instruments. It was they who had made the music. There were 4 great centaurs. The horse part of them was like a huge English farm horses, and the man part was like a stern but beautiful giant's. There was also a unicorn, and a bull with the head of a man, and a pelican, and an eagle, and a great dog. And next to Aslan stood 2 leopards, of whom one carried his crown and the other his standard. But as for Aslan himself, the beavers and the children didn't know what to do or say when they saw him. People who have not been to Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. If the children had ever thought so, they were cured of it now. For when they tried to look at Aslan's face, they just caught a glimpse of the golden mane and the great, royal, solemn, overwhelming eyes. And then they found that they couldn't look at him and went all trembly. "Go on," whispered Mr. Beaver. "No," whispered Peter, "you first." No, sons of Adam before animals," whispered Mr. Beaver back again. "Susan," whispered Peter, "what about you? Ladies first." "No, you're the eldest," whispered Susan, and of course the longer they went on doing this, the more awkward they felt. Then, at last, Peter realized that it was up to him. He drew his sword and raised it to salute, and hastily saying to the others, "Come on, pull yourselves together," he advanced to the lion and said, "We have come, Aslan." "Welcome, Peter, son of Adam," said Aslan. "Welcome, Susan and Lucy, daughters of Eve. Welcome, he-beaver and she-beaver." His voice was deep and rich, and somehow took the fidgets out of them. They now felt glad and quiet, as it didn't seem awkward to them to stand and say nothing. "But where is the 4th?" asked Aslan. "He had tried to betray them and joined the White Witch, O Aslan," said Mr. Beaver, and then something made Peter say, "That was partly my fault, Aslan. I was angry with him, and I think that helped him to go wrong." And Aslan said nothing, either to excuse Peter or to blame him, but merely stood looking at him with his great unchanging eyes, and it seemed to all of them that there was nothing to be said. "Please, Aslan," said Lucy, "can't anything be done to save Edmund?" "All shall be done," said Aslan, "but it may be harder than you think." And then he was silent again for some time. Up to that moment, Lucy had been thinking how royal and strong and peaceful his face looked. Now it suddenly came into her head that he looked sad as well. But in the next minute that expression was quite gone. The lion shook his mane and clapped his paws together. Terrible paws, thought Lucy, if he didn't know how to velvet them, and said, "Meanwhile, let the feast be prepared. Ladies, take these daughters of Eve to the pavilion and minister to them." When the girls had gone, Aslan laid his paw, and though it was velveted, it was very heavy, on Peter's shoulder and said, "Come, son of Adam, and I will show you a far-off sight in the castle where you are to be king." And Peter, with his sword still drawn in his hand, went with the lion to the eastern edge of the hilltop. There, a beautiful sight met their eyes. The sun was setting behind their backs. That meant that the whole country below them lay in the evening light, forest and hills and valleys, and winding away like a silver snake, the lower part of the great river. And beyond all this, miles away, was the sea. And beyond the sea, the sky, full of clouds which had just been turning rose color and with the reflection of the sunset. But just where the land of Narnia met the sea, in fact, at the mouth of the great river, there was something on a little hill shining. It was shining because it was a castle, and of course, the sunlight was reflected from all the windows which looked towards Peter in the sunset. But to Peter, it looked like a great star resting on the seashore. That, O man of said Aslan, is Cair Paravel of the Four Thrones, in one of which you must sit as king. I show it to you because you are the firstborn, and you will be high king over all the rest. And once more Peter said nothing, for at that moment a strange noise woke the silence suddenly. It was like a bugle, but richer. It is your sister's horn, said Aslan to Peter in a low voice, so low as to be almost a purr. If it is not disrespectful to think of a lion purring. For a moment Peter did not understand. Then, when he saw all the other creatures start forward and heard Aslan say with a wave of his paw, "Back, let the prince win his spurs," he did understand, and set off running as hard as he could to the pavilion, and there he saw a dreadful sight. The naiads and dryads were scattering in every direction. Lucy was running towards him as fast as her short legs would carry her, and her face was as white as paper. Then he saw Susan make a dash for a tree and swing herself up, followed by a huge gray beast. At first, Peter thought it was a bear. Then he saw that it looked like an Alsatian. I don't know what that is, though it was far too big to be a dog. Okay, some type of dog. Then he realized that it was a wolf standing on its hind legs, with its front paws against the tree trunk, snapping and snarling. All the hair on its back stood up on end. Susan had not been able to get higher than the second big branch. One of her legs hung down so that her foot was only an inch or two above the snapping teeth. Peter wondered why she did not get higher, or at least take a better grip. Then he realized that she was just going to faint, and that if she fainted, she would fall off. Peter did not feel very brave. Indeed, he felt as if he was going to be sick. But that made no difference to what he had to do. He rushed straight up to the monster and aimed a slash of his sword at its side. That stroke never reached the wolf. Quick as lightning, it turned round, its eyes flaming and its mouth wide open in a howl of rage. It had not been so angry that it's simply... I'm sorry. I missed track on the page. If it had not been so angry that it simply had to howl, it would have got him by the throat at once. As it was, though, all this happened too quickly for Peter to think at all. He had just time to duck down and plunge his sword as hard as he could between the brute's forelegs into its heart. Then came a horrible, confused moment, like something in a nightmare. He was tugging and pulling at the wolf, and this wolf seemed neither alive nor dead, and its bared teeth knocked against his forehead, and everything was blood and heat and hair. A moment later, he found that the monster lay dead, and he had drawn his sword out of it and was straightening his back and rubbing the sweat off his face and out of his eyes. He felt tired all over. Then, after a bit, Susan came down the tree. She and Peter felt pretty shaky when they met, and I won't say they weren't kissing and crying on both sides, but in Narnia no one thinks any of the worse for you for that. "Quick, quick," shouted the voice of Aslan. "Centaurs, eagles, I see another wolf in the thickets, there, behind you. He has just darted away. After him, all of you. He'll be going to his mistress. Now is your chance to find the witch and rescue the fourth son of Adam." And instantly, with a thunder of hooves and a beating of wings, a dozen or so of the swiftest creatures disappeared into the gathering darkness. Peter, still out of breath, turned and saw Aslan close at hand. "You have forgotten to clean your sword," said Aslan. It was true. Peter blushed when he looked at the bright blade and saw it all smeared with the wolf's hair and blood. He stooped down and wiped it quite clean on the grass, and then wiped it quite dry on his coat. "Hand it to me and kneel, son of Adam," said Aslan. And when Peter had done so, he struck him with the flat of the blade and said, "Rise up, Sir Peter Wolfsbane, and whatever happens, never forget to wipe your sword." Chapter 13. Deep Magic from the Dawn of Time. Now we must get back to Edmund. When he had been made to walk farther than he had ever known that anybody could walk, The witch at last halted in a dark valley, all overshadowed with fir trees and yew trees. Edmund simply sunk down and lay on his face, doing nothing at all, and not even caring what was going to happen next, provided that they would let him lie still. He was too tired even to notice how hungry and thirsty he was. The witch and the dwarf were talking close beside him in low tones. "No," said the dwarf. "It is no use now, Queen. They must have reached the stone table by now." "Perhaps the wolf will smell us out and bring us news," said the witch. "And it cannot be good news if he does," said the dwarf. "4 thrones in Cair Paravel," said the witch. "How if only 3 were fulfilled? That would not fulfill the prophecy." "What difference would it make now that he is here?" said the dwarf. He did not dare even now to mention the name of Aslan to his mistress. "He may not stay long, and then we would fall upon the 3 at Cair." "Yet it might be better," said the dwarf, "to keep this one." Here he kicked Edmund. "For bargaining with." "Yes, and have him be rescued," said the witch scornfully. "Then," said the dwarf, "we had better do what we have to do at once." "I would like to have it done on the stone table itself," said the witch. "That is the proper place. That is where it has to..." My gosh, I'm sorry. That's still the witch speaking. "That is the proper place. That is where it has always been done before." "It will be a long time now before the stone table again can be put to its proper use," said the dwarf. "True," said the witch, and then, "Well, I will begin." At that moment, with a rush and a snarl, a wolf rushed up to them. "I've seen them. They're all at the stone table with him. They have killed my captain, Malgrim. I was hidden in the thickets and saw it all. One of the sons of Adam killed him. Fly, fly!" "No," said the witch. "There need be no flying. Go quickly, summon all our people to meet me here as speedily as they can. Call out the giants and the werewolves and the sprites of those trees who are on our side. Call the ghouls and the boggles, the ogres and the minotaurs. Call the cruels, the hags, the spectres, and the people of the toadstools. We will fight. What? Have I not still my wand? Will not their ranks turn into stone, even as they come on? Be off quick. I have little thing to finish here while you are away." The great brute bowed its head, turned, and galloped away. "Now," she said, "we have no table. Let me see. We had better put it against the trunk of a tree." Edmund found himself being roughly forced to his feet. Then the dwarf set him with his back against the tree and bound him fast. He saw the witch take off her outer mantle. Her arms were bare underneath it and terribly white. Because they were so very white, he could see them. But he could not see much else. It was so dark in this valley under the dark trees. "Prepare the victim," said the witch, and the dwarf undid Edmund's collar and folded back his shirt at the neck. Then he took Edmund's hair and pulled his head back so that he had to raise his chin. After that, Edmund heard a strange noise. Whiz, whiz, whiz. After a moment, he couldn't think what it was. Then he realized it was the sound of a knife being sharpened. At that very moment, he heard loud shouts from every direction, a drumming of hooves and a beating of wings, a scream from the witch, confusion all around him, and then he found he was being untied. Strong arms were around him, and he heard big, kind voices saying things like, "Let him lie down, give him some wine, drink this, steady now, you'll all be all right in a minute." Then he heard the voices of people who were not talking to him, but to one another. They were saying things like, "Who's got the witch? I thought you had her. I didn't see her after I knocked the knife out of her hand. I was after the dwarf. You mean to say she's escaped? Chap can't mind everything at once. What's that? Oh, sorry, it's only an old stump." But just at this point, Edmund went off in a dead faint. Presently, the centaurs and unicorns and deer and birds, they were all, of course, the rescue party, which Aslan had sent in the last chapter, all set off to go back to the stone table, carrying Edmund with them. But if they could have seen what happened in the valley after they had gone, I think they might have been surprised. It was perfectly still, and presently the moon grew bright. If you had been there, you would have seen the moonlight shining on an old tree stump and on a fair-sized boulder. But if you had gone on looking, you would gradually have begun to think that something was odd about that stump and the boulder. And the next you would have thought that the stump did look quite remarkably like a little fat man crouching on the ground. And if you had watched long enough, you would have seen the stump walk across to the boulder and the boulder sit up and begin talking to the stump. For in reality, the stump and the boulder were simply the witch and the dwarf. For it was part of her magic that she could make things look what they aren't, and she had presence of mind to do so at the very moment when the knife was knocked out of her hand. She had kept hold of her wand, so it had kept the knife safe too. So it had been kept safe too. One moment. Sorry, pausing. Sorry about that. Had some outside stuff. Um. Uh. Da, da, da. She had kept hold of her wand, so it had been kept safe too. When the other children woke up the next morning, they had been sleeping on piles of cushions in the pavilion. The first thing they heard from Mrs. Beaver was that their brother had been rescued and brought into camp late last night and was at that moment with Aslan. As soon as they had breakfasted, they all went out, and there they saw Aslan and Edmund walking together in the dewy grass, apart from the rest of the court. There is no need to tell you, and none ever heard, what Aslan was saying, but it was a conversation which Edmund never forgot. As the others drew near, Aslan turned to meet them, bringing Edmund with him. "Here is your brother," he said, "and there is no need to talk to him about what is past." Edmund shook hands with each of the others and said to each of them in turn, "I'm sorry," and everyone said, "That's all right." And then everyone wanted very hard to say something which would make it quite clear that they were all friends with him again, something ordinary and natural, and of course no one could think of anything in the world to say. But before they had time to feel really awkward, one of the lepers approached Aslan and said, "Sire, there is a message from the enemy who craves audience." "Let him approach," said Aslan. The leopard went away and soon returned leading the witch's dwarf. "What is your message, son of Earth?" asked Aslan. "Queen of Narnia and Empress of the Lone Isles desires a safe conduct to come and speak with you," said the dwarf, "on a matter which is much to your advantage and to hers." "Queen of Narnia, indeed," said Mr. Beaver. "All the cheek." "Peace, Beaver," said Aslan. "All names will soon be restored to their proper owners. In the meantime, we will not dispute about them. Tell your mistress, son of Earth, that I grant her safe conduct on condition that she leaves her wand behind her at the great oak." This was agreed to, and the two leopards went back with the dwarf to see that the conditions were properly carried out. "But supposing she turns the two leopards into stone," whispered Lucy to Peter. I think the same idea had occurred to the leopards themselves at any rate. As they walked off, their fur was all standing up on their backs, and their tails were bristling like a cat's when it sees a strange dog. "It'll be all right," whispered Peter in reply. "He wouldn't send them if it weren't." A few minutes later, the witch herself walked out onto the top of the hill and came straight across and stood before Aslan. Three children, who had not seen her before, felt shudders running down their backs at the sight of her face, and there were low growls among all the animals present. Though it was bright sunshine, everyone felt suddenly cold. The only two people present who seemed to be quite at their ease were Aslan and the witch herself. It was the oddest thing to see those two faces, the golden face and the dead white face, so close together. Not that the witch looked Aslan exactly in the eyes. Mrs. Beaver particularly noticed this. "You have a traitor there, Aslan," said the witch. Of course everyone present knew she meant Edmund, but Edmund had got past thinking about himself after all he'd been through, and after the talk he'd had that morning. He just went on looking at Aslan. It didn't seem to matter what the witch said. Well, said Aslan, his offense was not against you. Have you forgotten the deep magic? Said the witch. Let us say I have forgotten it, answered Aslan gravely. Tell us of this deep magic. Tell you, said the witch, her voice growing suddenly shriller, tell you what is written on the very table of stone which stands beside us. Tell you what is written in letters deep as a spear is long on the firestones on the secret hill. Tell you what is engraved on the scepter of the emperor beyond the sea. You at least know the magic which the emperor put into Narnia at the very beginning. You know that every traitor belongs to me as my lawful prey, and that for every treachery I have a right to a kill. Oh, said Mr. Beaver, so that's how you came to imagine yourself a queen. Because you were the emperor's hangman, I see. Peace, Beaver, said Aslan with a very low growl. And so, continued the witch, that human creature is mine. His life is forfeit to me. His blood is my property. Come and take it then, said the bull with the man's head in a great bellowing voice. Fool, said the witch with a savage smile that was almost a snarl. Do you really think your master can rob me of my rights by mere force? He knows the deep magic better than that. He knows that unless I have blood, as the law says, all Narnia will be overturned and perish in fire and water. It is very true, said Aslan. I do not deny it. Oh, Aslan, whispered Susan in the lion's ear, you won't, will you? Can't we do something about the deep magic? Isn't there something you can work against it? Work against the Emperor's magic, said Aslan, turning to her with something like a frown on his face, and nobody ever made that suggestion to him again. Edmund was on the other side of Aslan, looking all the time at Aslan's face. He felt a choking feeling, and wondered if he ought to say something, but a moment later he felt that he was not expected to do anything except to wait and do what he was told. Fall back, all of you, said Aslan, and I will talk to the witch alone. They all obeyed. It was a terrible time, this, waiting and wondering while the lion and the witch talked earnestly together in low voices. Lucy said, Oh, Edmund, and began to cry. Peter stood with his back to the others, looking out at the distant sea. The beavers stood holding each other's paws with their heads bowed. The centaurs stamped uneasily with their hooves, but everyone became perfectly still in the end, that you noticed even small sounds, like a bumblebee flying past, or the birds in the forest down below them, or the wind rustling the leaves, and still the talk between Aslan and the White Witch went on. At last they heard Aslan's voice. You can all come back, he said. I have settled the matter. She has renounced the claim on your brother's blood. And all over the hill there was a noise as if everyone had been holding their breaths and had now begun breathing again. And then a murmur of talk. The witch was just turning away with a look of fierce joy on her face when she stopped and said, But how do I know this promise will be kept? Ah! Roared Aslan, half rising from his throne, and a great mouth opened wider and wider, and the roar grew louder and louder, and the witch, after staring for a moment with her lips wide apart, picked up her skirts and fairly ran for her life. Chapter 14. The Triumph of the Witch. As soon as the witch had gone, Aslan said, We must move from this place at once. It will be wanted for other purposes. We shall encamp tonight at the ford of Baruna. Of course, everyone was dying to ask him how he had arranged matters with the witch, but his face was stern, and everyone's ears were still ringing with the sound of his roar, and so nobody dared. After a meal, which was taken in the open air on the hilly top, for the sun had gotten strong by now and dried the grass, they were busy for a while, taking the pavilion down and packing things up. Before 2 o'clock they were on the march and set off in northeasterly direction, walking at an easy pace, for they had not far to go. During the first part of the journey, Aslan explained to Peter his plan of campaign. As soon as she has finished her business in these parts, he said, the witch and her crew will almost certainly fall back to her house and prepare for a siege. You may or you may not be able to cut her off and prevent her from reaching it. He then went on to outline 2 plans of battle, one for fighting the witch and her people in the wood, and another for assaulting her castle. And all the time he was advising Peter how to conduct the operation, saying things like, you must put your centaurs in such and such place, or you must post scouts to see what she does not do, and so, till at last Peter said, But you will be there yourself, Aslan. I can give you no promise of that, answered the lion, and he continued giving Peter his instructions. For the last part of the journey, it was Susan and Lucy who saw most of him. He did not talk very much, and seemed to them to be sad. It was still afternoon when they came to a place where the river valley had widened out and the river was broad and shallow. This was the fords of Baruna, and Aslan gave orders to halt on this side of the water, but Peter said, wouldn't it be better to camp on the far side, for fear she should try a night attack or anything? Aslan, who seemed to have been thinking about something else, roused himself with a shake of his magnificent mane and said, what's that? Peter said it all over again. No, said Aslan in a dull voice, as if it didn't matter. No, she will not make an attack tonight. And then he sighed deeply, but presently he added, all the same, it was a well thought of. That is how a soldier ought to think. It doesn't really matter. So they proceeded to pitch their camps. Aslan's mood affected everyone that evening. Peter was feeling uncomfortable too at the idea of fighting the battle on his own. The news that Aslan might not be there had come at a great shock to him. Supper that evening was a quiet meal. Everyone felt how different it had been the previous night, or even that morning. It was as if the good times, having just begun, were already drawing to their end. This feeling affected Susan so much that she couldn't get to sleep when she went to bed. And after she had lain counting sheep and turning over and over, she heard Lucy give a soft sigh and turn over just beside her in the darkness. Can't you get to sleep either? Said Susan. No, I thought you were asleep. I say, Susan, what? I have a most horrible feeling, as if something were hanging over us. Have you? Because as a matter of fact, so have I. Something about Aslan, said Lucy. Either some dreadful thing is going to happen to him, or something dreadful that he's going to do. There's been something wrong with him all afternoon, said Susan. Lucy, what was it he said about not being with us at the battle? You don't think he could be stealing away and leaving us tonight, do you? Where is he now? Said Lucy. And is he here in the pavilion? I don't think so. Susan, let's go outside and have a look round. We might see him. All right, let's, said Susan. We might just as well be doing that as lying awake here. Very quickly, the two girls groped their way among the other sleepers and crept out of the tent. The moonlight was bright and everything was quite still except for the noise of the river chattering over the stones. Then Susan suddenly caught Lucy's arm and said, Look, on the far side of the campground, just where the trees begin. On the far side of the campground, just where the trees begun, they saw the lion slowly walking away from them into the wood. Without a word, they both followed him. He led them up the steep slope out of the river valley and then slightly to the right, apparently by the very same route which they had used that afternoon in coming from the hill of the stone table. On and on he led them into dark shadows and out into pale moonlight, getting their feet wet with the heavy dew. He looked somehow different from the Aslan they knew. His tail and his head hung low, and he walked slowly as if he were very, very tired. Then, when they were crossing a wide open place where there were no shadows for them to hide in, he stopped and looked round. It was no good trying to run away, so they came towards him. When they were closer, he said, Oh, children, children, why are you following me? We couldn't sleep, said Lucy, and then felt sure that she need say no more, that Aslan knew all they had been thinking. Please, may we come with you, wherever you're going? Asked Susan. Well, said Aslan, and seemed to be thinking. Then he said, I should be glad for company tonight. Yes, you may come, if you will promise to stop when I tell you, and after that, leave me to go on alone. Thank you, and we will, said the two girls. Forward they went again, and one of the girls walked on each side of the line. But how slowly he walked, and his great royal head drooped so that his nose nearly touched the grass. Presently he stumbled and gave a low moan. Aslan, dear Aslan, what is wrong? Can't you tell us? Said Lucy. Are you ill, dear Aslan? Asked Susan. No, said Aslan. I am sad and low. Lay your hands on my mane so that I can feel you're there. Let us walk like that. And so the girls did what they would never have dared to do without his permission, but what they had longed to do ever since they first saw him. Buried their cold hands in the beautiful sea of fur and stroked it, and so doing walked with him. And presently they saw that they were going with him up the slope of the hill on which the stone table stood. They went up at the side where the trees came farthest up, and when they got to the last tree, it was one that had some bushes around it. Aslan stopped and said, "O children, children, here you must stop, and whatever happens, do not let yourself be seen. Farewell." And both the girls cried bitterly, though they hardly knew why, and clung to the lion and kissed his mane and his nose and his paws and his great sad eyes. Then he turned from them and walked out onto the top of the hill. And Lucy and Susan, crouching in the bushes, excuse me, looked after him, and this is what they saw. A great crowd of people were standing all around the stone table, and though the moon was shining, many of them had carried torches which burned with evil-looking red flames and black smoke. But such people, ogres with monstrous teeth, and wolves and bull-headed men, spirits of evil trees and poisonous plants, and other creatures whom I won't describe, because if I did, the grown-ups would probably not let you read this book. Cruel hags and incubuses, wraiths, horrors, efreets, sprites, orkneys, woozes, and ettins. In fact, there were all of those who were on the witch's side, and whom the wolf had summoned at her command. And right in the middle, standing by the table, was the witch herself. A howl and a gibber of dismay went up from the creatures when they first saw the great lion pacing towards them, and for a moment even the witch seemed to be struck with fear. Then she recovered herself and gave a wide, fierce laugh. "The fool!" she cried. "The fool has come. Bind him fast." Lucy and Susan held their breaths, waiting for Aslan's roar and his spring upon his enemies, but it never came. 4 hags, grinning and leering yet, also at first hanging back and half afraid of what they had to do, had approached him. "Bind him, I say," repeated the white witch. The hags made a dart at him and shrieked with triumph when they found that he made no resistance at all. Then others, evil dwarfs and apes, rushed in to help them, and between them they rolled the huge lion over on his back and tied all 4 paws together, shouting and cheering as if they had done something brave, though, had the lion chosen, one of those paws could have been the death of them all. But he made no noise, even when the enemies, straining and tugging, pulled the cords so tight that they cut into his flesh. Then they began to drag him towards the stone table. "Stop!" cried the witch. "Let him first be shaved." Another roar of mean laughter went up from her followers as an ogre with a pair of shears came forward and squatted down by Aslan's head. Snip, snip, snip went the shears, and masses of curling gold began to fall to the ground. Then the ogre stood back, and the children, watching from their hiding place, could see the face of Aslan looking all small and different without his mane. The enemies also saw the difference. "Why, he's only a great cat after all," cried one. "Is that what we're afraid of?" said another. And they surged round Aslan, jeering at him, saying things like "Puss, puss, poor pussy," and "How many mice have you caught today, cat?" and "Would you like a saucer of milk, pussums?" "Oh, how can they?" said Lucy, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The brutes! The brutes!" For now that the first shock was over, the shorn face of Aslan looked to her braver and more beautiful and more patient than ever. "Muzzle him," said the witch. And even now, as they worked about his face, putting on the muzzle, one bite from his jaws would have cost 2 or 3 of them their hands, but he never moved. And this seemed to enrage all the rabble. Everyone was at him now. Those who had been afraid came near, even after he was bound, began to find their courage, and for a few minutes the 2 girls could not even see him. So thickly was he surrounded by the whole crowd of creatures, kicking him, hitting him, spitting on him, jeering at him. At last the rabble had enough of this. They began to drag the bound and muzzled lion to the stone table, some pulling and some pushing. He was so huge that even when they got him there, it took all their effort to hoist him up onto the surface of it. Then there was more tying and tightening of cords. "Cowards, the cowards," sobbed Susan. "And they are still afraid of him, even now?" When once Aslan had been tied, and tied so that he was really a mass of cords on the flat stone, a hush fell on the crowd. 4 hags holding 4 torches stood at the corners of the table. The witch bared her arms as she had bared them the previous night, and when it had been Edmund instead of Aslan. Then she began to whet her knife. It looked to the children, when the gleams of the torchlight fell on it, as if the knight were made of stone, not of steel, and it was of a strange and evil shape. At last she drew near. She stood by Aslan's head. Her face was working and twitching with passion, but his looked up at the sky, quiet, neither angry nor afraid, but a little sad. Then, just before she gave the blow, she stooped low down and said in a quivering voice, "Now, who has won? Fool, you think that by all of this you would save the human traitor? Now I will kill you instead of him, and our pact was... Sorry. Now I will kill you instead of him, as our pact was, and so the deep magic will be appeased. But when you are dead, what will prevent me from killing him as well? And who will take him out of my hand then? Understand, you have given me Narnia forever. You have lost your own life, and you have not saved his. That knowledge, despair and die." The children did not see the actual moment of the killing. They couldn't bear to look, and it covered their eyes. Chapter 15. Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment the children were for a second in a very great danger. For with wild cries and a noise of skirling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the top of the hill and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the spectres go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs. And overhead there went a flurry of foul wings and blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept onto the open hilltop. The moon was getting low, and thin clouds were passing across her, but still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. At dawn they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, left of it, and cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness and cried again, and then again were silent. At last Lucy said, "I can't bear to look at that horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, their fingers were cold, and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again, and kissed it, and fondled it, and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cords so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you've been up all night and cried till you have had no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes an end of such quietness. Comes in the end and a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing is ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt to these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was some tiny movements going on in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw that whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stone of the stone table. And now, whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were little gray things. "Ugh," said Susan from the other side of the table. "How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beasts!" And she raised her hand to frighten them away. "Wait," said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely still. "Can you see what they're doing?" Both girls bent down and stared. "I do believe," said Susan. "But how queer! They're nibbling away at the cords." "That's what I thought. I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things, they don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him. It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. You could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big, low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed rope. Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew and they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered it. Soon there were birds singing all around the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. "I'm so cold," said Lucy. "So am I," said Susan. "Let us walk about a bit." They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark and gray. But beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count, between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm, and oh, how tired their legs felt. Then at last, as they stood for a moment looking out towards the sea and Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment, they heard from behind them a loud noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a glass pane. "What's that?" said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn around," said Susan. "Something awful is happening." "You're doing something worse to him," said Lucy. "Come on." And she turned, pulling Susan round with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed. But for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken in 2 pieces by a great crack that ran down it from one end. There was no Aslan. "Oh, oh, oh," cried the 2 girls, rushing back to the table. "Oh, it's too bad," sobbed Lucy. "They might have left the body alone." "Who's done it?" cried Susan. "Who does it mean? Is it magic? What does it mean?" "Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. "It is more magic." They looked round. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan!" cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead, then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. "You're not, said Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real, you're real, oh, Aslan!" cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him in kisses. "But what does it all mean?" asked Susan, when they were somewhat calmer. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still, which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little farther, into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read that there is a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. And now—" "Oh, yes, now?" said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can." He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over it to reach him. Aslan leapt again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, almost letting them catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all 3 of them rolled over together in a happy laughing heap of fur, arms, and legs. It was such a romp as no one had ever had except in Narnia, and whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. "And now," said Aslan pleasantly, "to business. I feel I am going to roar. You'd better put your fingers in your ears." And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that he did not dare to look at it. And they saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roaring, as grass bends in the meadow before the wind. Then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me." And he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm golden back, and Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave he rose underneath them, and then shot off, faster than any horse could go, downhill and into the thick of the forest. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Think of that, and then take away the horse, heavy noise, and the hooves, and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the almost noiseless padding of great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of golden fur, and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you are going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the smallest streams, wading the larger, swimming the largest of all, and you are riding not on a road nor in a park, not even on the downs, but right across Narnia, in spring, down solemn avenues of beech, across sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains, and along giddy ridges, and down, down, down again, into wild valleys, and off into acres of blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle. A little toy castle it looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time to even ask themselves what it was, they were already on level with it. And now it was no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight as a bullet towards it. "The witch is home," he cried. "Now, children, hold tight." Next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them. For the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had just made, and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. Chapter 16. What happened about the statues. "What an extraordinary pace!" cried Lucy. "All those stone animals, and people too. Extraordinary place. It's like a museum." Hush, said Susan. "Aslan's doing something." He was, indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked round, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad, which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on its right, and rushed on to two centaurs. But at that moment, Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper, which is properly up in a grate against an unlit fire. And for a second, nothing seems to have happened, and then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along its white marble back. Then it spread. Then the color seemed to lick all over him as the flame licks all over a bit of paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and stretched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisked around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so beautiful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum, it looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing round him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colors. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, ruddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarves, and the birch girls in silver, the beech girls in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look, is it safe?" Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "That wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy, but it was too late to do anything about it now, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later, he lifted his club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's the dreaded little witch that was running about on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what was really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again, so that at last he understood, then he bowed down till his head was no longer farther off than the top of a haystack, and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1 you have never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. "Now, for the inside of this house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone, upstairs and downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed." And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fussy old castle echoed with openings of windows, and with everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another little winding stair! Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo! Call Aslan! Whew! How it smells in here! Look out for trap doors! Up here! There's a whole lot more on the landing!" But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs, shouting out, "Aslan, Aslan, I found Mr. Tumnus! Oh, do come quick!" A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing round and round for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and was, of course, very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last, the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and sweet spring air flooding in all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard. And it was then that someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had got in by jump, and the gates were still locked. That'll be all right," said Aslan, and then rising up on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. "Hi, you up there," he roared. "What's your name?" "Giant Rumpelbuffin. It has pleased your honor," said the giant, once more touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Buffin, oh my god, Rufflebuffin," said Aslan. "Just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honor. It will be a pleasure," said Giant Rufflebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, you little ones." Then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. and when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim stone yard, to see through the gaps, and all the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest, and the blue hills beyond that, and beyond them the sky. Sorry, what? Ah, okay. Blowed if I ain't all in a muck sweat, said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. Comes of being out of condition. I suppose neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about you? Yes, I have, said Lucy, standing up on tiptoe and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. Thank you, Mrs., said Giant Rufflepuffin, stooping down. Next moment, Lucy got a rather fright, for she found herself caught up in mid-air between the giant's fingers and thumb. But just as she was getting near to his face, he suddenly started and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, Bless me, I've picked up a little girl instead. I beg your pardon, missy. I thought you was the handkerchief. I feel like this is... Yeah, 10 seconds. We are almost... 10, 9, 8. We're actually right about at the end of the story. I am surprised. Got like 1, 2, 3 pages? 4. 3 and some. And then we're at the end of that. And we start the next book. My gosh. I can read chat now. Is just Scope Magnum used in place of reading classes? Blind the witch, the audacity of that bitch. Hope everyone's having a good night. Oh, we got raided. Don't know how many people are still hanging in there. Oh, nice. I hope, and if anyone's sleeping, I hope they're having good dreams and nothing weird about the creepy story. Then we have this other one, Through the Fairy Hall. So we got this other book we read during ads, Through the Fairy Halls. We finished the weird knockoff version of Sleeping Beauty. This next one, I think, is a poem? The Assembling of the Fays by Joseph Rodman Drake. They come from the beds of lichen green, they creep from the million's velvet screen. Some of the backs of beetles fly from silver tops of moon-touched trees, where they swung in their cobweb hammocks high and rocked about in the evening breeze, and now they throng the moonlit glade, above, below, on every side. This doesn't rhyme very much. Their little minimum forms arrayed in the tricksy pomp of fairy pride. I don't know, whatever. And the next one is called The Good Comrades of the Flying Ship, a Russian tale. Okay. There lived once upon a time in Russia a peasant and his wife, and they had 3 sons. 2 were clever, but the third was thought a fool. The elder brothers were forever telling him he had no wits, and he found himself always treated as if no use whatsoever. One day, when all heard that a writing had come from the Tsar, which said, Whoever builds a ship that can fly, to him I will give my daughter, the Tsarevna, to wife. The elder brothers resolved to go and seek their fortune, and they begged a blessing of their parents. The mother got ready their things for the journey, and gave them the best she had in the house to eat on the way. Then the fool began to beg and send him off too. His mother told him he should not go. Why shouldst thou go? Said the mother. Dost thou think thou canst do what wiser men cannot? But the fool was already singing the same refrain. I think I can, I want to go. At length his mother saw she could do nothing with him, so she gave him a poor crust of black bread and sent him out. The fool went, and at last he met an old man. They greeted each other, and the old man said, Where art thou going? Look now, said the fool, the Tsar has promised to give his daughter to him who shall make him a flying ship. And canst thou make such a ship? No, I cannot, but I'll get it made for me somewhere. And where is that somewhere? God only knows. God only knows. Well, in that case, sit down here, rest and eat a bit. Share with me what thou had in thy knapsack. Nay, it is such stuff that I am ashamed to share it with thee. Nonsense, take it out. What God has given is quite good enough to be eaten. The fool undid his knapsack and could hardly believe his eyes. There, instead of a dry crust of brown bread, lay white rolls and divers savory meats. What does that even mean? A diverse. They forgot the E at the end of this word. And diverse savory meats. What? Oh, hello. We'll put that on hold for the next intermission. Let's finish this book. No, no, said Lucy, laughing. Here it is. This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him that a saccharine tablet would be to you, so that when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his great red face, she said, I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin. Not at all, not at all, and the giant politely. Never met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy. So, I don't know how to describe it. What a nice giant he is, said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. Oh, yes, said the fawn. All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was, but an old family, with traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, she'd never have turned him into stone. At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. Our day's work is not yet over, he said. If the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle before bedtime. I'm sorry. We got a curfew. Gotta wake up tomorrow early. Gonna have to get the witch killed by 9 p.m. We got bedtime. What? Mommy's gonna come back and put us to bed. We're gonna get grounded. Parents walk in the room. What you doing? Nothing. Are you defeating the witch? No. Better not be. Are you murdering again? No. No murdering after hours. I warned you. Sorry. Okay, before bedtime, we must find the battle at once. And join in, I hope, sir, said the largest of the centaurs. Of course, said Aslan. And now, those who cannot keep up, that is, children, dwarfs, and small animals, must ride on the backs of those who can, that is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants, and eagles. Dang, you get to ride some eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves. And with a great deal of bustle and cheering, they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere, pretending to be very busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, Did you hear what he said? Us lions! That makes him and me. That us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions. That meant him and me. And at last he went on saying this till Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. It's adorable. When all were ready, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting them sorted into their proper order. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first the lions and dogs went nosing about in all directions, but then suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after this. Soon all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others, streaked out for about half a mile behind them, were following as fast as they could. The noise and the music of the hounds was mixed with the roar of the other lion, and sometimes the far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went, as the scent became easier and easier to follow, and then, just as they came to the last curve in a narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all the noises another noise, a different one, which gave her a queer feeling inside. It was a noise of shouts and shrieks, and of the clashing of metal against metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now, in the daylight, they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand. But she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair were in the center. On each side, the line stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. Then, with a roar that shook all Narnia from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted towards him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. Then the lion and the witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and the same moment all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines, dwarfs with their battle axes, dogs with their teeth, the giant with his club, and his feet also crushed dozens of the foe. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs with swords and hooves, and Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of the onset. Chapter 17. The Hunting of the White Stag. The battle was all over a few minutes after their arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions, and when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took flight. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to see her Peter looking as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed so much older. It was all Edmund's doing. It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan, Peter was saying. We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone, right and left, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was just turning one of your leopards to a statue, and when he reached her, he had the sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly and simply getting made a statue himself for his pains. That was the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, he began to have some chance, if we hadn't lost so many already. He was terribly wounded. We must go see him. They found Edmund in the charge of Mrs. Beaver, a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood, his mouth was open, and his face a nasty green color. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been gifted her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are other people wounded," said Aslan, while she was still looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any result. "Yes, I know," said Lucy crossly. "Wait a minute." "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a graver voice, "others are also at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund?" "I'm sorry, Aslan," said Lucy, getting up and going with him. For the next half hour they were busy. She attended to the wounded, while he restored those who had been turned to stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet, and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had ever seen him look. Oh, for ages. In fact, ever since his first term at that horrid school, which was where he had begun to go wrong, he'd become his real old self again. And he could look in your face. And could look you in the face. That's a weird wording. His real old self again and could look you in the face. And there on the field of battle, Aslan made him a knight. "Does he know," whispered Lucy to Susan, "what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was?" "Hush, no, of course not," said Susan. "Oughtn't he be told?" said Lucy. "Oh, surely not," said Susan. "It would be too awful for him. Think how you'd feel if he were him." "All the same, I think he ought to know," said Lucy, but at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for them all, I don't know, but somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock. The next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river, and the next day after, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle at Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. Before them were the sands with rocks and little pools of salt water, and seaweed and the smell of the sea, and long miles of bluish green waves breaking for ever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls! Have you ever heard it? Can you remember? That evening, after tea, the four children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But the next day was more solemn. Then, in the great hall at Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof and the west wall hung with peacock feathers and the eastern door which looks towards the sea, in the presence of all their friends, with the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the four thrones amid deafening shouts of "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen. Bear it well, sons of Adam, bear it well, daughters of Eve, said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore, and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and scepters were put in their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends, to Tumnus the fawn, to the beavers, and the great and giant Rufflebuff, to the leopards, and the good centaur, and the good dwarfs, and to the lion. And to that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing, came the music of the sea people. But amidst all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away, and when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it, for Mr. Beaver had warned them. You'll be coming and going. He'll be coming and going, he had said. One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know, not like a tame lion. And now, you see, the story is nearly, but not quite, at an end. These two kings and two queens governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent in seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them, and indeed, for a long time, there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest. A haunting here, a killing there, a glimpse of a werewolf one month, and a rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all the foul brood was stamped out, and they made good laws, and kept the peace, and saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, and liberated young dwarfs. Sorry, I'm imagining them going to the woods. Are you a good tree? This one's a bad tree. Chop it down. You didn't speak up for Aslan. It's like, I was trying to flee the witch and you slapped me in the face. Bad tree. And liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers, and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite a different sort from giant Rufflebuffin, in the north of Narnia, where they ventured across the frontier. And they entered in friendships and alliances with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state, and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them, and Peter became tall and deep-chested man, and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage, and she was called Queen Susan the Gentle. Edmonton was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden-haired, and all princes in those parts desired her for their queen, and her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. So they lived in great joy, and if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year it fell out that Tumnus, who was a middle-aged fawn by now and beginning to be stout, came down river and brought them news that the white stag had once more appeared in his parts. The white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him. So these two kings and two queens, with their principal members of the court, rode a hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag. And they had not hunted long before they gave before they had a sight of him. And he led them a great pace over rough and smooth, and through thick and thin, till the horses from all their courtiers were tired out. Till the horses of all their courtiers were tired out, and these four were still following. And they saw the stag enter into a thicket where their horses could not follow. Then, said King Peter, for they talked quite in different style now, having been kings and queens for so long, fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses, and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I have never hunted a nobler quarry. Sir, said the others, even so let us do. So they alighted and tied their horses to trees, and went out into the thick wood on foot. As soon as they had entered it, Queen Susan said, Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to see a tree of iron. Madam, said King Edmund, if you look upon it well, you shall see it is a pillar of iron with a lantern set atop it thereof. By the lion's mane, a strange device, said King Peter, to set a lantern here where the trees cluster so thick about it and so high above it that if it were lit it should give light to no man. Sir, said Queen Lucy, by likelihood when this post and this lamp were set here, there were smaller trees in this place, or fewer, or none, for this is a young wood, and the iron post is old. And they stood looking upon it. Then, said King Edmund, I know naught of it, but this lamp on the post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen this like before, as if it were a dream, or in the dream of a dream. Sir, answered they all, it is even so with us also. And more, said Queen Lucy, for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures, or else some great change of our fortunes. Madam, said King Edmund, the like foreboding stirreth in my heart also. And in mine, fair brother, said King Peter. And mine also, said Queen Susan. Wherefore, by my counsel, we shall lightly return to our horses and follow this white stag no further. Madam, said King Peter, therein I pray thee to have me excused, for never since we four were kings and queens in Narnia have we set out hands to any higher matter as battles, quests, feats in arms, acts of justice, and the like, and then given over. But always what we have taken in hand, the same we have achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my royal brother speaks rightly, and it seems to me that we should be ashamed if for any fearing or foreboding we turn back from following so noble a beast as now we have in chase. And so say I, said King Edmund, and I have such desire to find the signification of this thing that I would not by my good will turn back for the richest jewel in all Narnia and all the islands. Then, in the name of Aslan, said Queen Susan, if you will all have it so, then let us go on and take the adventure that shall fall to us. So these kings and queens entered the thicket, and before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered that the thing they had seen was called a lamp-post, and before they had gone 20 more, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And the next moment they all came tumbling out of a wardrobe door into the empty room. They were no longer kings and queens in their hunting array, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of the same on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they never came into the empty room, and so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story, if it hadn't been that they felt they really must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats out of the wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or even to tell lies, but believed the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe door to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route. Nor would the coats be much use by now if you did. What's that? Yes, of course you'll go back to Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. Don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone else unless you find that the adventures are the same sort themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know all right. Odd things, they say. Even their looks will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools? And that is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. And that's the end of that book. The next book in this series would be The Horse and His Boy. Say what now? Yes, The Horse and His Boy. And there's a nice little map here. This has got Archenland, Stormness Head, Anvard Pass into Narnia. So Narnia would be to the north of the Archenland Mountains. And then there's a big desert that takes up most of the map we get to see. If Cathis is kind enough, I could actually screenshot this or take a photo and send it to him. Let's see about doing that. If it'll let me load my Discord. Silly Twitch. Going here. Go. An unfortunate crease in the middle of this, but oh my gosh, my flash was so bright. I need to bookmark here so I don't lose that. Incoming picture. Did you get it? Cool. I don't know if there's any other photos. That just seemed important. So The Horse and His Boy. We got 15 chapters. It says to David and Douglas Gresham. It'd be chapter 1, how Shasta set out. What? I'm sorry. That's the best I could do. I said it was a big map and it seemed important. I'm sorry. I'm trying so hard. I feel like good enough. Desert. What? I don't know if anyone's even looking. Not a big deal. What? Yep. Okay. You just minimized it. Well, you can bring it up if ever it seems important. How Shasta set out on his travels. This is the story of an adventure that happened in Narnia and Calormen and the lands between, in the Golden Age when Peter was High King in Narnia, and his brother and his 2 sisters were king and queens under him. In those days, far south in Calormen, on a little creek of the sea, there lived a poor fisherman called Ashin, and with him there lived a boy called him Father. The boy's name was Shasta. On most days, Arshish, my bad, I said the name wrong. Arshish, went out in his boat to fish in the morning, and in the afternoon he harnessed his donkey to a cart and loaded the cart with fish, and went a mile or so southward to the village to sell it. If it had sold well, he would come home in moderately good temper and say nothing to Shasta. but if it had sold badly, he would find fault with him and perhaps beat him. There was always something to find fault with, for Shasta had plenty of work to do, minding and washing the nets, cooking the supper, cleaning the cottage in which they both lived. Shasta was not at all interested in anything that lay south of his home, because he had once or twice been to the village with Ashish and knew that there was nothing very interesting there. In the village, he only met other men who were just like his father, men with long, dirty robes and wooden shoes turned up at the toe, and turbans on their heads, and beards, talking to one another very slowly about things that sounded dull. But he was very interested in everything that lay to the north, because no one ever went that way, and he was never allowed to go there himself. And when he was sitting out of doors minding the nets, and all alone, he would often look eagerly to the north. One could see nothing but a grassy slope running up to a level ridge, and beyond that the sky with perhaps a few birds in it. Sometimes, if Ashish was there, Shasta would say, "Oh, my father, what is there beyond the hill?" And then, if the fisherman was in a bad temper, he would box Shasta's ears and tell him to attend to his work. Or, if he was in a peaceable mood, he would say, "Oh, my son, do not allow your mind to be distracted by idle questions." For one of the poets has said, "Application to a business is the root of prosperity, but those who ask questions that do not concern them are steering the ship of folly towards the rock of in, indigence." Shasta thought that beyond the hill there must be some delightful secret which his father wished to hide from him. In reality, however, the fisherman talked like this because he did not know what lay to the north. Neither did he care. He was a very practical mind. One day there came from the south a stranger who was unlike any man that Shasta had ever seen before. He rode upon. No, this is a horse and his boy. What's wrong? This is the Big Book of Narnia. It is. It's kind of an in-between story between when they first go to Narnia and then they return to Narnia. It's okay. Resume. Sure, sure. This is the most of this is unusual because most of the stories are by people from Earth who enter to Narnia. This is the perspective of a citizen or a denizen of the world in which Narnia resides. There's another story about, like, I think there's two other stories that are like this in the whole series. I think one that's focuses the viewpoint of Prince Caspian, the one about the silver chair, and then there's the other one when Narnia falls. But anyways, again, we'll find out because the series will be a refresher for me. It's been a long time since I've read these. Practical mind. One day there came a man unlike any man that Shasta had ever seen before. He rode upon a strong, dappled horse with flowing mane and tail, and his stirrups and bridle were inlaid with silver. The spike of a helmet projected from the middle of his silken turban, and he wore a shirt of chainmail. By his side hung a curving scimitar, a round shield studded with bosses of brass hung at his back, and his right hand grasped a lance. His face was dark, but this did not surprise Shasta, because all the people of Colorman were like that. What did surprise him was the man's beard, which was dyed crimson and curled and gleaming with scented oil. But Arshish knew by the gold in the stranger's bare arm that he was a Tarkhan, or great lord, and he bowed kneeling before him till his beard touched the earth, and made signs to Shasta to kneel also. The stranger demanded hospitality for the night, which of course the fishermen dared not refuse. All the best they had was set before the Tarkhan for supper, and he didn't think much of it. And Shasta, as always happened when the fisherman had company, was given a hunk of bread and turned out of the cottage. On these occasions he usually slept with the donkey in his little thatched stable, but it was much too early to go to sleep yet, and Shasta, who had never learned that it was wrong to listen behind doors, sat down with his ear to a crack in the wooden wall of the cottage to hear what the grown-ups were talking about. And this is what he heard. "And now, O my host," said the Tarkan, "I have a mind to buy that boy of yours." Oh, oh, my master, replied the fisherman, and Shasta knew by the wheedling tone the greedy look that was probably coming from his face as he said it. Coming into his face as he said it. What price could induce your servant, poor though he is, to sell into slavery his only child and his only flesh? Has not one of the poets said, natural affection is stronger than soup and offering more precious than carbuncles? It is even so, replied the guest dryly, but another poet has likewise said, he who attempts to deceive the judicious is already burying his own back for the scourge. Do not load your aged mouth with falsehoods. This boy is manifestly no son of yours, for your cheek is as black as mine, but the boy is fair and white like the accursed but beautiful barbarians who inhabit the remote north. How well it is said, answered the fisherman, that swords can be kept off with shields, but the eye of wisdom pierces through every defense. Know then, O my formidable guest, that because of my extreme poverty I have never married and have no child. But in that same year in which the Tisroc, may he live forever, began his august and beneficent reign, on a night when the moon was at her full, it pleased the gods to deprive me of my sleep. Therefore I arose from my bed in this hovel and went forth to the beach to refresh myself with looking upon the water and the moon and breathing the cool air. And presently I heard a noise of oars coming to me across the water, and there, as it were, a weak cry. And shortly after, a tide brought to the land a little boat in which there was nothing but a man lean with extreme hunger and thirst, who seemed to have died but a few moments before, for he was still warm, and an empty water skin, and a child still living. Doubtless, said I, that these unfortunates have escaped from the wreck of a great ship, but by the my gosh, give me a second here. But by the admirable designs of the gods, the elder had starved himself to keep the child alive, and has perished in sight of land. Accordingly, remembering how the gods never fail to reward those who befriend the destitute, and being moved by compassion, for your servant is a man of tender heart. Leave out all these idle words of your own praise, interrupted the Tarkan. It is enough to know that you took the child, and have had 10 times the worth of his daily bread out of him in labor, as anyone can see. And now tell me at once what price you put on him, for I am wearied with your what? The fuck? The words. Loquacity? That's a fun one. You yourself has widely said, answered Arshish, that the boy's labor has been to me of inestimable value. This must be taken into account in fixing the price, for if I sell the boy, I must undoubtedly either buy or hire another to do his work. I'll give you 15 crescents for him, said the Tarkan. 15, cried Arshish in a voice that was something between a whine and a scream. 15 for the prop of my old age and the delight of my eyes. Do not mock my grey beard. Tarkan though you may be, my price is 70. At this point, Shasta had got up and tiptoed away. He had heard all he wanted, for he had often listened when men were bargaining in the village and knew how it was done. He was quite certain that Arshish would sell him in the end for something much more than 15 crescents and much less than 70, but that he and Tarkan would take hours in getting to an agreement. You must not imagine that Shasta felt at all as you or I would feel if he had just overheard his parents talking about selling us for slaves. For one thing, his life was already little better than slavery. For all he knew, the lordly stranger on the great horse might be kinder to him than Arshish. For another, the story about his own discovery in the boat had filled him with excitement and a sense of relief. He had often been uneasy because, try as he might, he had never been able to love the fisherman, and he knew that a boy ought to love his father. Now, apparently, he was no relative to Arshish at all. That took a great weight off his mind. Why, might be anyone, he thought. I might be the son of a Tarkan myself, or the son of a Tisroc, may he live forever, or of a god. He was standing out in the grassy place before the cottage, while he thought these things. Twilight was coming on apace, and a star or two was already out. but the remains of the sunset could still be seen in the west. Not far away, the stranger's horse, loosely tied to an iron ring at the wall of the donkey's stable, was grazing. Shasta strolled over to it and patted its neck, went on tearing up the grass, and took no notice of him. Then another thought came into Shasta's mind. I wonder what sort of man the Tarkan is, he said out loud. It would be splendid if he was kind. Some of the slaves in a great lord's house have next to nothing to do. They wear lovely clothes and eat meat every day. Perhaps he'd take me to the wars, and I'd save his life in a battle. And then he'd set me free and adopt me as his son, give me a palace, and a chariot, and a suit full of armor. Then he might be a horrid, cruel man. He might send me to work on the fields in chains. I wish I knew. How can I know? I bet this horse knows. If only he could tell me. The horse had lifted its head. Shasta stroked its smooth satin nose and said, I wish you could talk, old fellow. Then for a second he thought he was dreaming, for quite distinctly, though in a low voice, the horse said, But I can. Shasta stared into its great eyes, and his own grew almost as big with astonishment. However did you learn to talk? Hush, not so loud, replied the horse. Where I come from, nearly all the animals talk. Wherever is that? Asked Shasta. Narnia, answered the horse. The happy lands of Narnia. Narnia of the heathery mountains and the thymy downs. Narnia of the many rivers and flashing glens. The mossy caverns and the deep forests ringing with the hammers of the dwarfs. Oh, sweet air of Narnia. An hour's life there is better than 1,000 years in Colorman. It ended with a whinny that sounded very much like a cry. How did you get here? Said Shasta. Kidnapped, said the horse, or stolen, or captured, whichever you'd like to call it. I was only a fool at the time. My mother warned me not to range the southern slopes into Archenland and beyond, but I wouldn't heed her, and by the lion's mane I have paid for my folly. All these years I have been a slave to humans, hiding my true nature and pretending to be dumb and witless like their horses. Why didn't you tell them who you were? Not such a fool, that's why. If they'd once found out I could talk, they would have made a show of me at fairs and guarded me more carefully than ever. My last chance of escape would have been gone. And why, began Shasta, but the horse interrupted him. Now look, we mustn't waste time on idle questions. You want to know about my master, the Tarkan Aradin. Well, he's bad. Not too bad for me, for a war horse costs too much to be treated very badly. But you'd be better lying dead tonight than go be a human slave in his house tomorrow. Then I'd better run away, said Shasta, turning very pale. Yes, you had, said the horse. But why not run away with me? Are you going to run away too? Said Shasta. Yes, if you'd come with me, answered the horse. This is the chance for both of us. You see, if I run away without a rider, everyone who sees me will say, Stray horse. They'll be at me quick as you can. With a rider, I have a chance to get through. That's where you can help me. On the other hand, you can't get very far on those two silly legs of yours. What absurd legs humans have, without being overtaken. But on me, you can outdistance any other horse in this country. That's where I can help you. By the way, I suppose you know how to ride? Oh, yes, of course, said Shasta. At least, I've ridden the donkey. Ridden the what? Retorted the horse with extreme contempt. At least, that's what he meant. Actually, it came out a sort of neigh. Ridden the what? Talking horses always become more horsey in accent when they are angry. In other words, he continued, you can't ride. It's a drawback. I'll have to teach you as we go along. If you can't ride, you'll fall. Sorry, if you can't ride, can you fall? Suppose anyone can fall, said Shasta. I mean, can you fall and get up again without crying, and mount again and fall again, yet not be afraid of falling? I'll try, said Shasta. Poor little beast, said the horse in a gentler tone. I forget you're only a fool.
We'll make a fine rider of you in time. And now, we mustn't start until those two in the hut are asleep. Meantime, we can make our plans. My Tarkan is on his way north to the great city, to Tashban itself and the court of the Tisroc. I say, put in Shasta in a rather shocked voice, oughtn't you to say, may he live forever? Why, said the horse, I'm a free Narnian. Why should I talk slaves and fools talk? I don't want him to live forever, and I know that he's not going to live forever, whether I want him to or not. And I can see you're from the free north, too. No more of this southern jargon between you and me. And now, back to our plans. As I as I said, my human was on his way north to Tashban. Does he mean... Does that mean we better go to the south? I think not, said the horse. You see, he thinks I'm dumb and witless like his other horses. Now, if I really were, the moment I got loose, I'd go back home to my stable and paddock, back to his palace, where it's just 2 days' journey south. That is where he'll look for me. He'll never dream of my going on north on my own. And anyway, he will probably think that someone in the last village who saw him ride through has followed us to here and stolen me. Oh, hooray, said Shasta. Then we'll go north. I've been longing to see the north all my life. Of course you have, said the horse. That's because of the blood that's in you. I'm sure you're a true northern stock. Not too loud. I should think they'll be asleep soon now. Better creep back and see, suggested Shasta. That's a good idea, said the horse. But take care you're not caught. It was a good deal darker now, and very silent except for the sound of the waves on the beach, which Shasta hardly noticed because he had been hearing it day and night as long as he could remember. The cottage, as he approached it, showed no light. When he listened at the front, there was no noise. When he went round to the only window, he could hear, after a second or two, the familiar noise of the old fisherman's squeaky snore. It was funny to think that if all went well, he would never hear it again. Holding his breath, feeling a little bit sorry, maybe less sorry than he was glad, Shasta glided away over the grass and went to the donkey's stable, roped along to a place he knew where the key was hidden, opened the door, and found the horse's saddle and bridle, which had been locked up there for the night. He bent forwards and kissed the donkey's nose. I'm sorry we can't take you, he said. There you are at last, said the horse when he got back to it. I was beginning to wonder what had become of you. I was getting your things out of the stable, said Shasta. Now, can you tell me how to put them on? The next few minutes, Shasta was at work very cautiously to avoid jingling, while the horse said things like, get that girth a bit tighter, or you'll find a buckle lower down, or need to shorten those stirrups a good bit. When all was finished, he said, now, we've got to have reins for the look of the things, but you won't be using them. Tie them to the saddle bow, very slack, so that I can do what I like with the head. Remember, you are not to touch them. What are they for, then? Said Shasta. Ordinarily, they are for directing me, replied the horse. But as I intend to do all the directing on this journey, you are pleased to keep your hands to yourself. And there's another thing. I am not going to have you grabbing my mane. But I say, pleaded Shasta, if I'm not to hold you by the reins or by your mane, what am I to hold you by? You hold on with your knees, said the horse. That's the secret of good riding. Grip my body between your knees as hard as you like. Sit up straight, straight as a poker. Keep your elbows in. And by the way, what do you do with the spurs? Put them on my heels, of course, said Shasta. I do know that much. Then you can take them off and put them in the saddlebag. You may be able to sell them when we get to Tashban. Ready? Now I think you'll get up. And now I think you can get out. Oh, you're a dreadful height, gasped Shasta after his first and unsuccessful attempt. I'm a horse, that's all, seemed the reply. Anyone would think I was a haystack from the way you're trying to climb up me. Why, that's better. Now sit up and remember what I told you about your knees. Funny to think of me who has led cavalry charges and won races, having a potato sack like you in the saddle. However, off we go, he chuckled, not unkindly. And he certainly began their night journey with great caution. First of all, he went just south to the fisherman's cottage, to the little river where they ran out into the sea. He took care to leave in the mud some very plain hoof marks pointing south. But as soon as they were in the middle of the ford, he turned upstream and waited till they were about 100 yards farther inland than the cottage.
Then he selected a nice gravelly bit of bank, which would make no footprints, and came out onto the northern side. Then, still at a walking pace, he went northward to the cottage, the one tree, the donkey stable, and the creek, everything, in fact, that Shasta had ever known had sunk out of sight in the gray summer night darkness. They had been going uphill, and now were at the top of the ridge, that ridge which had always been the boundary of Shasta's known world. He could not see what was ahead except for... Hold on a second. He could not see what was ahead except that it was all open and grassy. It looked endless, wide, and lonely, and free. "I say," observed the horse, "what a place for a gallop, eh?" "Oh, don't let's," said Shasta. "Not yet. I don't know how to... Please, horse, I don't know what your... Sorry. Please, horse, I don't know your name." "Really? Why?" "Breeny, hinny, breeny, hoony, ha," said the horse. "I'll never be able to say that," said Shasta. "Can I call you Bree?" "Well, if it's the best you can do, I suppose you must," said the horse. "And what shall I call you?" "I'm called Shasta." Said Bree. "Well, now there's a name that's really hard to pronounce. But how now about this gallop? It's a good deal easier than trotting, if you only knew, because you don't have to rise and fall. Grip with your knees and keep your eyes straight ahead between my ears. Don't look at the ground. If you think you're going to fall, just grip harder and sit up straighter. Ready? Now for Narnia and the North." Horse is kind of mean. "Hello, welcome to the reading, Carrie." "The what?" "The what?" "No." So, Chapter 2, A Wayside Adventure. It was nearly noon on the following day when Shasta was wakened by something warm and soft moving over his face. He opened his eyes and found himself staring into the long face of a horse. Its nose and lips were almost touching his. He remembered the exciting events of the previous night and sat up. But as he did so, he groaned. "Oh, Bree," he gasped. "I'm so sore. All over. I can hardly move." "Good morning, small one," said Bree. "I was afraid you might feel a bit stiff. It can't be the falls. You didn't have much more than a dozen or so. And it was all lovely, soft, springy turf that must have been almost a pleasure to fall on." Horse is kind of a jerk. "And the only one that might have been nasty was broken by that gorse bush." "No, it's the riding itself that comes hard at first. What about breakfast? I've had mine." "Oh, bother breakfast. Bother everything," said Shasta. "I tell you, I can't move." But the horse nuzzled at him with his nose and pawed him gently with a hoof till he had to get up. And then he looked about him and saw where they were. Behind them lay a little corpse. Before them, the turf dotted with white flowers sloped down to the brow of a cliff. Far below them, so that the sound of the breaking waves was very faint, lay the sea. Shasta had never seen it from such a height, never seen so much of it before, nor dreamed how many colors it had. On either hand, the coast stretched away, headland after headland, and the points you could see... And at the points you could see the white foam running up the rocks, but making no noise because it was so far off. There were gulls flying overhead, and the heat shivered on the ground. It was a blazing day. But what Shasta chiefly noticed was the air. He couldn't think what was missing until at last he realized that there was no smell of fish in it. For, of course, neither in the cottage nor among the nets had he ever been away from the smell in his life. And this new air was so delicious, and all his old life seemed so far away, that he forgot for a moment about his bruises and his aching muscles and said, "I say, Bree, didn't you say something about breakfast?" "Yes, I did," said Bree. "I think you'll find something in the saddlebags. They're over there on that tree where you hung them up last night. Or early this morning, rather."
They investigated the saddlebags, and the result was cheering. A meaty pasty, only slightly stale, a lump of dried figs, and another lump of green cheese, a little flask of wine, and some money, about 40 crescents in all, which was more than Shasta had ever seen. While Shasta sat down, painfully and cautiously, with his back against the tree, and started on the pasty, Bree had a few more mouthfuls of grass to keep him company. "Won't it be stealing to use the money?" asked Shasta. "Oh," said the horse, looking up with his mouthful of grass. "I never thought of that. A free horse and a talking horse mustn't steal, of course. But I think it's all right. We're prisoners and captives in enemy country. That money is booty, spoil. Besides, how are you to get any food for you without it? I suppose, like all humans, you won't eat natural food like grass and oats." "I can't." "Ever tried?" "Yes, I have. I can't get it down at all. You couldn't either if you were me." "You're rum little creatures, you humans," remarked Bree. When Shasta had finished his breakfast, which was by far the nicest he'd ever eaten, Bree said, "I think I'll have a nice stroll before we put on the saddle again," and he proceeded to do so. "That's good. That's very good," he said, rubbing his back on the turf and waving all four legs in the air. "You ought to have one too, Shasta," he snorted. "It's most refreshing." But Shasta burst out laughing and said, "You do look funny when you're on your back." "I look nothing of the sort," said Bree, but then suddenly he rolled around on his side, raised his head, and looked hard at Shasta, blowing a little. "Does it really look funny?" he said in an anxious voice. "Yes, it does," replied Shasta, "but what does it matter?" "You don't think, do you?" said Bree. "Then it might be a thing talking horses never do. A silly clownish trick I've learned from the dumb ones. It would be dreadful to find when I get back to Narnia that I've picked up a lot of low bad habits. What do you think, Shasta? Honestly now. Don't spare my feelings. Do you think the real free horses, the talking kind, roll?" "How should I know? Anyway, I don't think it should bother about it. I don't think I should bother about it if I were you. We've got to get there first. Do you know the way?" "I know the way to Tashban. After that comes the desert. Oh, we'll manage the desert somehow, never fear." "Why, we'll be in sight of the northern mountains then. Think of it. To Narnia and the north. Nothing will stop us then. But I'll be glad to be past Tashban. You and I are safer away from cities." "Can't we avoid it?" "Not without going a long way inland, and that would take us into cultivated land, main roads, and I wouldn't know the way. No, we'll just have to creep along the coast. Up here on the downs we'll meet nothing but sheep and rabbits and gulls and a few shepherds. And by the way, what about starting?" Shasta's legs ached terribly as he saddled Bree and climbed into the saddle, but the horse was kindly to him and went at a soft pace all afternoon. When evening twilight came, they dropped by steep tracks into a valley and found a village. Before they got into it, Shasta dismounted and entered it on foot to buy a loaf and some onions and radishes. The horse trotted round by the fields in the dusk and met Shasta at the far side. This became the regular pattern every second night. These were great days for Shasta, and every day better than the last, as his muscles hardened and he fell less often. Even at the end of his training, Bree still said he sat like a bag of flour in the saddle. "And even if it was safe, young'un, I'd be ashamed to be seen with you on the main road." But in spite of his rude words, Bree was a patient teacher. No one can teach riding so well as a horse. Shasta learned to trot, to canter, to jump, and to keep his seat even when Bree pulled up suddenly or swung unexpectedly to the left or the right, which, as Bree told him, was a thing you might have to do at any moment in a battle. And then, of course, Shasta begged to be told of the battles and wars in which Bree had carried the Tarkin. And Bree would tell of forced marches and the fording of swift rivers, of charges and of fierce fights between cavalry and cavalry when the war horses fought as well as the men, being all fierce stallions, trained to bite and kick and to rear at the right moment, so that the horse's weight as well as the riders would come down on an enemy's crest. What? Okay. Enemy's crest in the stroke of a sword or a battle axe, but Bree did not want to talk about the wars as often as Shasta wanted to hear about them. "Don't speak of them, youngster," he would say. "They were only the Tisrock wars, and I fought in them as a slave and a dumb beast. Give me the Narnian Wars, where I shall fight as a free horse among my own people. Those will be wars we're talking about. Narnian the North. Broo. Shasta soon learned, when he heard Bree talking like that, to prepare for a gallop. After they had traveled on for weeks and weeks, past more bays and headlands and rivers and villages than Shasta could remember, there came a moonlit night when they started their journey at evening, having slept during the day. They had left the downs behind them and were crossing a wide plain with a forest about half a mile away on their left. The sea, hidden by low sandhills, was about the same distance on their right. They had jogged along about an hour, sometimes trotting, sometimes walking, when Bree suddenly stopped, and this is a good time to put a pause for the ad break. Ah, timing. How long is this one? The Horse and His Boy looks like a bit of a longer story. Only slightly. Ish nice. I said ish nice. Ad started yet? 13 seconds. Listen to me slurp. Or not. And then while the ad's going, we'll read this other weird story. The Russian tale about the idiot boy. These stories are weird. So we good? Okay. The fool undid his knapsack and could hardly believe his eyes. There, instead of the dry crust of brown bread, lay white rolls and diverse savory meats, and he gave of it to the old man. So they ate together, and the old man said to the fool, "Go into the woods, straight up to the first tree. Strike the trunk with thine axe, and then fall with thy face to the ground, and wait till thou art aroused." What the fuck? That is so weird. What the hell did I just write? Strike the trunk with thine axe, then fall with thy face to the ground, and wait till thou art aroused. That sentence so weird. I think they mean till you're woken up. Thou wilt see before thee a ship quite ready. Sit in it and fly, and whomsoever thou dost meet on the road, gather him up and give him a lift on his journey. So our fool blessed the old man, took leave of him, and went into the wood. He went up to the first tree and did exactly as he had been commanded. He struck the tree with his axe, fell with his face to the ground, and went to sleep. And just imagining, just like whack, 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 and then just face plant and then snore. In a little while, something or other awoke him. The fool rose up and saw the ship quite ready beside him. Without loss of time, he got into it, and the ship flew into the air. It flew, and look, there on the road below, a man was lying with his ear to the earth. "Good day, uncle," cried the fool. "Good day. What art thou doing?" "I am listening to what is going on in the world." "Art thou traveling?" "Yes." "Then take a seat in the ship beside me. I'll give thee a lift on thy journey." So the man got into the ship, and they flew on further. They flew, and look, a man who was coming along, hopping on one leg with the other leg tied to his ear. "Good day, uncle. Why art thou hopping on one leg?" "Why, if I were to untie the other, I should stride around half the world at a single stride, so long are my steps." "Then take thee a seat in the ship beside me." So the man got into the ship, and they flew on further. They flew, and look, a man was standing with a gun and taking aim, but at what they could not see. "Good day, uncle. What art thou aiming?" "Oh, I am aiming at a mark the size of a pea at a distance of 100 leagues. That's what I call shooting." "Art thou traveling?" "Yes." Or "Yea." "Then take a seat in my ship beside me. I'll give thee a lift on thy journey." So the man sat down, and they flew on. They flew, and look, a man was walking in the forest, and on his shoulders was a bundle of wood. "Good day, uncle. Why art thou dragging wood about?" "Oh, but it is not common wood." "Of what sort is it then?" "It is of such a sort that if it be scattered, a whole army will spring up." "Take a seat with us, then. I've heard this story before. Believe this is weird. I'll give thee a lift on thy journey. So he also sat down with them, and they flew on farther. They flew, and look, a man was carrying a sack of straw. Good day, uncle. Where art thou carrying that straw? To the village. Is there little straw in the village, then? Nay, but the straw is of such kind that if it were to be scattered on the hottest summer day, cold will at once set in with snow and frost. Take a seat with us, then. I'll give thee a lift on thy journey. So they flew, and soon they flew into the Tsar's courtyard. The Tsar was sitting at a table when he saw the flying ship drop from the sky just outside his window. In great surprise, he sent a servant to ask who it was that had accomplished the task. Oh, we're already back? I got sucked into this weird-ass story. What? I know, this went faster than I expected. I want to know what they're going to do. I feel like the Tsar is going to be all like, I'm not giving you my daughter, and then they're going to raise an army and attack. Or save the Tsar from something. Anyways. Though I do like the journey across the desert with the talking horse. So, walking, and Bree suddenly stopped. What's up? Said Shasta. Shh, 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 said Bree, craning his neck round and twitching his ears. Did you hear something? Listen. It sounds like another horse. Between us and the woods, said Shasta, after he had listened for about a minute. It is another horse, said Bree, and that's what I don't like. Isn't it probably just a farmer riding home late? Said Shasta with a yawn. Don't tell me, said Bree. That's not a farmer's riding, nor a farmer's horse either. Can't you tell by the sound? That's quality, that horse is, and it's being ridden by a real horseman. I tell you what it is, Shasta. There's a Tarkan under the edge of that wood. Not on his war horse. It's too light for that. On a fine blood mare, I should say. Well, it's stopped now, whatever it is, said Shasta. All right, said Bree, and why should he stop just when we do? Shasta, my boy, I do believe there's someone shadowing us at last. What should we do? Said Shasta in a lower whisper than before. Do you think he can see us as well as hear us? Not in his light, so long as we stay quiet. Sorry, quite still, answered Bree. But look, there's a cloud coming up. I'll wait till that gets over the moon. Then we'll get off on our right as quickly as we can, down to the shore. We can hide among the sandhills if the worst comes to the worst. They waited till the cloud covered the moon, and then, first at a walking pace, and afterwards at a gentle trot, made for the shore. The cloud was bigger and thicker than it had looked at first, and soon the night grew very dark, just as Shasta was saying to himself, must be nearly at the sandhills by now. His heart leaped into his mouth, because an appalling noise had suddenly risen up out of the darkness ahead, a long, snarling roar, melancholy and utterly savage. Instantly, Bree swerved round and began galloping inland again as fast as he could gallop. What is it? Gasped Shasta. Lions, said Bree, without checking his pace or turning his head. After that, there was nothing but sheer galloping for some time. At last they splashed across a wide, shallow stream, and Bree came to a stop on the far side. Shasta noticed that he was trembling and sweating all over. The water may have thrown the brute off our scent, panted Bree, when he had partly gotten his breath again. We can walk for a bit now. As they walked, Bree said, Shasta, I'm ashamed of myself. I'm just as frightened as a common dumb Calormeni horse. I am really. I don't feel like a talking horse at all. I don't mind swords and lances and arrows, but I can't bear those creatures. I think I'll trot for a bit. About a minute later, however, he broke into a gallop again, and no wonder, for the roar broke out again, this time on their left from the direction of the forest. Two of them, moaned Bree. When they had galloped for several minutes without any further noise from the lions, Shasta said, I say, the other horse is galloping beside us now, only a stone's throw away. All the better, panted Bree. Oh, wrong person. When they had galloped, I say, the other horse is galloping beside us now, only a stone's throw away. Oh, the better, panted Bree. Tarkan on it. We'll have a sword to protect us all. But Bree, said Shasta, we might just as well be killed by lions as caught, or I might. They'll hang me for horse stealing. He was feeling less frightened of the lions than Bree, because he had never met a lion. Bree had. Bree only snorted in answer, but he did sheer away to his right. Oddly enough, the other horse seemed to also be sheering away to the left, that in a few seconds the space between them had widened a good deal. But as soon as it did, so there came two more lion roars immediately after one another, one on the right and the other on the left, and the horses began drawing nearer together. So apparently that the lions, the roaring of the brutes on either side, was horribly close, and they seemed to be keeping up with the galloping horses quite easily. Then the cloud rolled away. The moonlight, astonishingly bright, showed up everything almost as if it were broad day. The two horses, the two riders, were galloping almost neck to neck and knee to knee, just as if they were in a race. Indeed, Bree said afterwards that a finer race had never been seen in Callerman. Shasta now gave himself up for lost and began to wonder whether the lions killed you quickly or played with you as a cat plays with a mouse, and how much it would hurt. At the same time, one sometimes does this, and in the most frightful moments, he noticed everything. He saw that the other rider was a very small, slender person, mail clad. The moon shone on the male, and riding magnificently. He had no beard.
Something flat and shining was spread out before them. Before Shasta had time even to guess what it was, there was a great splash, and he found his mouth half full of salt water. The shining thing had been a long inlet of the sea. Both horses were swimming, and the water was up to Shasta's knees. There was an angry roaring behind them, and looking back, Shasta saw a great shaggy and terrible shape crouched on the water's edge, but only one. We must have shaken off the other lion, he thought. The lion apparently did not think its prey worth a wetting. At any rate, it made no attempt to take to the water in pursuit. The two horses, side by side, were now well out into the middle of the creek, and the opposite shore could clearly be seen. The Tarkin had not yet spoken a word. But he will, thought Shasta. As soon as we have landed, what am I to say? I must be thinking out a story. Then suddenly, two voices spoke at his side. "Oh, I am so tired," said one. "Hold your tongue, Quinn." "Oh, I am so tired," said the one. "Hold your tongue, Quinn, and don't be a fool," said the other. I'm dreaming, thought Shasta. Could have sworn the other horse spoke. Soon the horses were no longer swimming, but walking, and soon, with a great sound of water running off their sides and tails, with a great crunching of pebbles under 8 hooves, they came out of the farther beach of the inlet. The Tarkin, to Shasta's surprise, showed no wish to ask questions. He did not even look at Shasta, but seemed anxious to urge his horse straight on. Bree, however, at once shouldered himself in the other horse's way. "Bree, steady there. I heard you, I did. There's no good pretending, ma'am. I heard you. You're a talking horse. A Narnian horse, just like me." "What's it got to do with you, if she is?" said the strange rider fiercely, laying a hand on sword hilt. But the voice in which the words were spoken already told Shasta something. "Why, it's only a girl!" he exclaimed. "What business is it of yours if I'm only a girl?" snapped the stranger. "You're a boy, a rude, common little boy, a slave probably, who's stolen his master's horse." "That's all you know," said Shasta. "He's not a thief, little Tarkina," said Bree. "At least, if there's been any stealing, you might just as well say I stole him. I stole him. And as for its not being my business, you wouldn't expect me to pass a lady of my own race in this strange country without speaking to her. It's only natural I should." "I think it's very natural, too," said the mayor. "I wish you'd held your tongue, Hwin," said the girl. "Look at the trouble you've gotten us into." "I don't know about trouble," said Shasta. "You can clear off as soon as you like. We shan't keep you." "No, you shan't," said the girl. "What a quarrelsome creature these humans are," said Bree to the mayor. "They're as bad as mules. Let's try to talk a little sense. I take it, ma'am, your story is the same as mine. Captured in early youth, years of slavery among the colormans." "Too true, sir," said the mayor with a melancholy whinny. "And now perhaps escape?" "Tell him to mind his own business, Hwin," said the girl. "No, I won't, Avarice. Sir Aravis," said the mare, putting her ears back. "This is my escape just as much as yours, and I'm sure a noble war horse like this is not going to betray us. We are trying to escape to get to Narnia."
And so, of course, are we, said Bree. Of course, you guessed that at once. A little boy in rags riding, or trying to ride a war horse at dead at night couldn't mean anything but an escape of some sort. And, if I may say so, a high-born Tarkina riding alone at night, dressed up in her brother's armor, and very anxious for everyone to mind their own business and ask her no questions. Well, if that's not fishy, call me a cob. All right then, said Avarice. Oh, sorry. All right then, said Aravis. You've guessed it. Quinn and I are running away. We're trying to get to Narnia, and now what about it? Why, in that case, what is to prevent us all going together? Said Bree. I trust, Madam Quinn, you will accept such assistance and protection as I may be able to give you on the journey. Why do you keep talking to my horse instead of me? Asked the girl. Excuse me, Tarkina, said Bree, with just the slightest backward tilt of his ears, but that's Calormen talk. We're free Narnians. Win and I suppose if you're running away to Narnia, you want to be one too. In that case, Win isn't your horse any longer. One might just as well say you're her human. The girl opened her mouth to speak and then stopped. Obviously, she had not quite seen it in that light before. Still, she said after a moment's pause, I don't know that there's so much point in all going together. Aren't we more likely to be noticed? Less, said Bree, and the mare said, Oh, do let's. I should feel much more comfortable. We're not even certain of the way. I'm sure a great charger like this knows far more than we do. Oh, come on, Bree, said Shasta. And let them go their own way. Can't you see they don't want us? Oh, sorry, that's Shasta. Oh my gosh. Sorry. Oh, come on, Bree, said Shasta. Let them go their own way. Can't you see they don't want us? We do, said Hwin. Look here, said the girl. I don't mind going with you, Mr. Warhorse. But what about this boy? How do I know he's not a spy? Why don't you say at once that you think I'm not good enough for you, said Shasta. Be quiet, Shasta, said Bree. The Tarkina's question is quite reasonable. I'll vouch for the boy. Tarkina, he's been true to me and a good friend, and he's certainly not either a Narnian or an Archenlander. All right then, let's go together. But she didn't say anything to Shasta, and it was obvious that she wanted Bree, not him. Splendid, said Bree. And now that we've got the water between us and those dreadful animals, what about you two humans taking off our saddles and our having a rest and hearing one another's stories? Both the children unsaddled their horses, and the horses had a little grass, and Aravis produced rather nice things to eat from her saddlebag, but Shasta sulked and said no thanks, and that he wasn't hungry, and he tried to put on what he thought was very grand and stiff manners. But as a fisherman's hut is not usually a good place for learning grand manners, the result was dreadful. And he half knew that it wasn't a success, and then became sulkier and more awkward than ever. Meanwhile, the two horses were getting on splendidly. They remembered the very same places in Narnia, the grasslands up above Beaver's Dam, and found that they were some sort of second cousins once removed. This made things more and more uncomfortable for the humans, until at last Bree said, And now, Tarkina, tell us your story, and don't hurry it. I'm feeling comfortable now. Aravis immediately began sitting quite still, and using a rather different tone and style from her usual one. For in Calormen, storytelling, whether the stories are true or made up, is a thing you're taught, just as English boys and girls are taught essay writing. The difference is that people want to hear the stories, whereas I've never heard of anyone who wanted to read the essays. So, Chapter 3, At the Gates of Tashbond. My name, said the girl at once, is Aravis Tarkina, and I am the only daughter of Kidrash Tarkan, the son of Rishti Tarkan, the son of Kidrash Tarkan, the son of Izombrem Tisroc, the son of Ardib Tisroc, who is descendant in a right line from the god Tash. My father is a lord of the province of Calavar, and is one who has the right of standing on his feet in his shoes before the face of Tisroc himself. May he live forever. My mother
on whom be the peace of the gods, is dead, and my father has married another wife. One of my brothers has fallen in battle against the rebels in the far west, and the other is a child. Now it has come to pass that my father's wife, my stepmother, hates me. And the sun appeared dark in her eyes as long as I lived in my father's house. And so she persuaded my father to promise me in marriage to Ashata Tarkan. Now this Ashata is of base birth, though in these latter years he has won the favor of the Tizrock, may he live forever, by flattery and evil counsels, and is now made a Tarkan and the lord of many cities, and is likely to be chosen as the great vizier when the present grand vizier dies. Is to be chosen as the grand vizier when the present grand vizier dies. Moreover, he is at least 60 years old, and has a hump on his back, and his face resembles that of an ape. Nevertheless, my father, because of the wealth and power of this Ashota, being persuaded by his wife, sent messengers offering me in marriage, and the offer was favorably accepted, and Ashota sent word that he would marry me this very year at the time of high summer. When this news was brought to me, the sun appeared dark in my eyes, and I laid myself on my bed and wept for a day. But on the second day I rose up and washed my face, and caused my mare Hwin to be saddled, and took with me a sharp dagger which my brother had carried in the western wars, and rode out alone. And when my father's horse was out of sight, and I was come to a green open place in a certain wood where there were no dwellings of men, I dismounted from Hwin my mare, and took out the dagger. Then I parted my clothes where I thought the readiest way lay to my heart, and prayed to all the gods that as soon as I was dead I might find myself with my brother. After that I shut my eyes and my teeth, and prepared to drive the dagger into my heart. But before I had done so, this mare spoke with the voice of one of the daughters of men, and said, "O my mistress, do not by any means destroy yourself, for if you live, you may yet have good fortune, but all the dead are dead alike." "I didn't say it half so well as that," muttered the mare. "Hush, hush, madam, hush," said Bree, who was thoroughly enjoying the story. "She's telling it in the grand colorman manner, and no storyteller in a Tizrock court could do it better. Pray go on, Tarkina." "When I heard the language of men uttered by my mare," continued Aravis, "I said to myself, the fear of death has disordered my reason and subjected me to delusions, and I became full of shame, for none of my lineage ought to fear death more than the biting of a gnat. Therefore I addressed myself a second time to the stabbing, but Hwin came near to me, and put her head in between me and the dagger, and discoursed to me most excellent reasons, and rebuked me as a mother rebukes her daughter. And now my wonder was so great that I forgot about killing myself, and about Ashota, and said, 'O my mare, how have you learned to speak like one of the daughters of men?' And Hwin told me what is known to all this company, that in Narnia there are beasts that talk. Now she herself was stolen from there when she was a little foal. She told me also of the woods and the waters of Narnia, and the castles and the great ships, till I said, 'In the name of Tash, and Azeroth, and Zardinan, Lady of the Night, I have a great wish to be in that country of Narnia.' 'O my mistress,' answered the mare, 'if you were in Narnia you would be happy, for in that land no maiden is forced to marry against her will.' And when we had talked together for a great time, hope returned to me, and I rejoiced that I had not killed myself. Moreover, it was agreed between Hwin and me that we should steal ourselves away together. We planned it in this fashion. We returned to my father's house, and I put on my gayest clothing, and sang and danced before my father, and presented to be delighted with the marriage which he had prepared for me. Also I said to him, 'O my father, and O to the delight of my eyes, give me your license and permission to go with one of my maidens alone for 3 days into the woods to do secret sacrifices to Sardina, Lady of the Night and of maidens, and as is proper and customary for demesnes when they must bid farewell to the service of Zardinan and prepare themselves for a marriage.' And he answered, 'O my daughter, and O the delight of my eyes, so shall it be.'
But when I came out from the presence of my father, I went immediately to the oldest of his slaves, his secretary, who had dandled me on his knee when I was a babe and loved me more than the air and the light, and I swore to him to be secret, and I begged him to write a certain letter for me. And he wept and implored me to change my resolution. But in the end, he said, to hear is to obey, and did at my will. And I sealed the letter and hid it in my bosom. But what was in the letter? Asked Shasta. Be quiet, youngster, said Bree. You're spoiling the story. She'll tell us all about the letter in the right place. Go on, Tarkina. Then I called the maid who was to go with me to the woods and perform the rites of Sardinan, and told her to wake me very early in the morning, and I became merry with her and gave her wine to drink. But I had mixed such things in her cup that I knew she must sleep for a night and a day. As soon as the household of my father had committed themselves to sleep, I arose and put on armor of my brother's, which I always kept in my chamber in his memory. I put on my girdle I put into my girdle all the money I had and a certain choice jewels, and provided myself also with food, and saddled the mare with my own hands, and rode away in the second watch of the night. I directed my course not to the woods where my father supposed that I would go, but north and east to Tashban. Now for 3 days and more I knew that my father would not seek me, being deceived by the words I had said to him, and so on the 4th day we arrived in the city of Azimbalda. Now, Azimbalda stands at the meeting of many roads, and from it in the posts of the Tisroc, may he live forever, ride on swift horses to every part of the empire. It is one of the rights and privileges of the greater Tarkans to send messages by them. I therefore went to the chief of the messengers in the house of the imperial posts in Azimbalda and said, O dispatcher of messages, here is a letter from my uncle Ashasta Tarkan to Kidrash Tarkan, lord of Kalavar. Take now these 5 crescents and cause it to be sent to him. And the chief of the messengers said, to hear is to obey. This letter was feigned to be written by Ashasta, and this was the signification of the writing. Ashasta Tarkan to Kidrash Tarkan, salutations and peace. In the name of Tash, the irresistible, the inexorable, be it known to you that I made my journey towards your house to perform the contract of marriage between me and your daughter, Aravis Tarkina. It pleased fortune and the gods that I fell ill with her in the forest when she had ended the rites and sacrifices of Zardinan according to the custom of the maidens. And when I learned who she was, being delighted with her beauty and discretion, I became inflamed with love, and it appeared to me that the sun would be dark to me if I did not marry her at once. Accordingly, I prepared the necessary sacrifices and married your daughter the same hour that I met her, and have returned with her to my own house. And we both pray and charge you to come hither as speedily as you may, that we may be delighted with your face and speech, and also that you may bring with you the dowry from my wife, which by reason of my great charges and expenses I require without delay. And because thou and I are brothers, I assure myself that you will not be angered by the haste of my marriage, which is wholly occasioned by the great love I bear of your daughter. And I commit you to the care of all the gods. As soon as I had done this, I rode on in all haste from Azimbalda, fearing no pursuit, and expecting that my father, having received such a letter, would send messages to Ashasta or go to him himself, and that before the matter was discovered I should be beyond Tashban, and that in the pith of my story, until this very night when I was chased by lions and met you at the swimming of the salt water. And what happened to the girl, the one you drugged? Asked Shasta. Doubtless she was beaten for sleeping late, said Aravis coolly, but she was a tool and a spy of my stepmother's. I am very glad they should beat her. I say, that's hardly fair, said Shasta. I did not do any of these things for the sake of pleasing you, said Aravis. And there's another thing I don't understand about the story, said Shasta. You're not grown up. I don't believe you're any older than I am. I don't believe you're as old. How could you be getting married at your age? Aravis said nothing, but Bria once said, Shasta, don't display your ignorance. They are always married at that age in the great Tarkan families. Shasta turned very red, though it was hardly light enough for the others to see it. Felt snubbed. Aravis asked Bree for his story. Bree told it, and Shasta thought that he put in a great deal more than he needed about the falls and the bad riding. Bree obviously thought it very funny, but Aravis did not laugh. When Bree had finished, they all went to sleep. The next day, all four of them, 2 horses and 2 humans, continued their journey together. Shasta thought that it had been very much pleasanter when he and Bree were on their own, for now it was Bree and Aravis who did nearly all the talking. Bree had lived a long time in Calormen and had always been among Tarkans and Tarkans' horses, and so, of course, he knew a great many of the same people and places that Aravis knew. She would always be saying things like, "But if you were at the fight of Zulindreth, you would have seen my cousin, Alamash," and Bree would answer, "Oh, yes, Alamash. He was only captain of the chariots, you know. I don't quite hold with chariots, or the kind of horses who draw chariots. They're not real cavalry. But he is a worthy nobleman. He filled my nosebag with sugar after the taking of Tibeth." Or else Bree would say, I was down at the lake of Mesril that summer," and Aravis would say, "Oh, Mesril, I had a friend there, Lasaraline Tarkhina. What a delightful place it is, those gardens in the Valley of the Thousand Perfumes." Bree was not in the least trying to leave Shasta out of things, though Shasta sometimes nearly thought he was. People who know a lot of the same things can hardly help talking about them. And if you're there, you can hardly help feeling that you're out of it. Quinn, the mare, was rather shy for a great warhorse like Bree, and said very little. And Aravis never spoke to Shasta at all if she could help it. Soon, however, they had more important things to think of. They were getting near Tashban. There were more and larger villages, and more people on the roads. They now did nearly all of their traveling by night, and hid as best they could during the day. And at every halt they argued about what they were to do when they reached Tashban. Everyone had been putting off this difficulty, but now it could be put off no longer. During these discussions, Aravish became a very little, less unfriendly to Shasta. One usually gets on better with people when one is making plans than when one is talking about nothing in particular. Bree said that the first thing now to do was to fix a place where they would all promise to meet on the far side of Tashban, even if, by any ill luck, they got separated in passing the city. He said the best place would be the tombs of the ancient kings on the very edge of the desert. "Things like great stone beehives," he said. "You can't possibly miss them. And the best of it is that none of the Calormens will go near them, because they think the place is haunted by ghouls and are afraid of it." Aravis asked if it wasn't really haunted by ghouls, but Bree said he was a free Narnian horse and didn't believe in these Calormen tales, and then Shasta said he wasn't a Calormen either and didn't care a straw about these old stories of ghouls. This wasn't quite true, but it rather impressed Aravish, though at the moment it annoyed her too. And of course she said she didn't mind any number of ghouls either, so it was settled that the tomb should be their assembly place on the other side of Tashban. And everyone felt that they were getting on very well, till Hwyn humbly pointed out that the real problem was not where they should go when they got through Tashban, but how they were going to get through it. "We'll settle that tomorrow, ma'am," said Bree. "Time for a little sleep now. And I think that this might be a time for a break, because my voice is getting hoarse." Hush. We have... Actually, I'll try to get to the end of this chapter. But it wasn't easy to settle. Aravis' first suggestion was that they should swim across the river below the city during the night and not go into Tashban at all. But Bree had 2 reasons against this. One was that the river mouth was very wide and would be far too long of a swim for Hwyn to do, especially with a rider on her back. He thought it would be too long for himself too, but he said much less about that. The other was that it would be full of shipping, and of course anyone on the dock of a ship who saw 2 horses swimming past would be almost certain to be inquisitive. Shasta thought that they should go up the river above Tashban and cross it where it was narrower, but Bree explained that there were gardens and pleasure houses on both banks
of the river for miles, and that there would be Tarkans and Tarkinas living in them, and riding about the roads and having water parties on the river. In fact, it would be the most likely place in the world for meeting someone who would recognize Aravis or even himself. "We'll have to have a disguise," said Shasta. Quinn said it looked to her as if the safest thing would go right through the city itself, from gate to gate, because it was less likely to be noticed in the crowd. But she approved of the idea of a disguise as well. She said, "Both the humans will have to dress in rags and look like peasants or slaves, and all Aravis's armor and our saddles and things must be made into bundles and put on our backs, and the children just pretend to drive us by, and people will think they're only pack horses." My dear Hwin," said Aravis rather scornfully, "as if anyone could mistake Bree for anything but a war horse, however you disguised him." "I should think not, indeed," said Bree, snorting and letting his ears go ever so slightly back. "I know it's not a very good plan," said Hwin, "but I think it's our only chance, and we haven't been groomed for ages, and we're not looking quite ourselves. At least, I'm sure I'm not. I do think if we get well plastered with mud and go along with our heads down, and if we're tired, as if we're tired and lazy, and don't lift our hooves hardly at all, we might not be noticed. And our tails ought to be cut shorter, not nearly, but all ragged, not neatly, "My dear madam," said Bree, "have you pictured to yourself how very disagreeable it would be to arrive in Narnia in that condition?" "Well," said Hwin humbly, she was a very sensible mare, "the main thing is to get there." Though nobody much liked it, it was Hwin's plan which had to be adopted in the end. It was a troublesome one and involved a certain amount of what Shasta called stealing and Bree called raiding. One farm lost a few sacks that evening, and another lost a coil of rope the next. But some tattered old boys' clothes for Aravis to wear had to be fairly bought and paid for in a village. Shasta returned with them in triumph just as the evening was closing in. The others were waiting for him among the trees at the foot of a low range of wooded hills which lay right across their path. Everyone was feeling excited because this was the last hill. When they reached the ridge at the top, they would be looking down on Tashban. "I do wish we were safely past it," muttered Shasta to Hwin. "Oh, I do," said Hwin fervently. That night, they wound their way through the woods up to the ridge by a woodcutter's track, and when they came out of the woods at the top, they could see thousands of lights in the valley below them. Shasta had no notion of what a great city would be like, and it frightened him. They had their supper, and the children got some sleep. The horses woke them very early in the morning. The stars were still out, and the grass was terribly cold and wet, but daybreak was just beginning, far to the right side across the sea. Aravis went a few steps away into the wood and came back looking odd in her new ragged clothes and carrying her real ones in a bundle. These, and her armor, and shield, and scimitar, and the 2 saddles, and the rest of the horse's fine furnishings, were put into the sacks. Bree and Hwin had already got themselves as dirty and bedraggled as they could, and it remained to shorten their tails. As the only tool for doing this was Aravis's scimitar, one of the packs had to be undone again in order to get it out. It was a longish job and rather hurt the horses. "My word," said Bree. "If I wasn't a talking horse, what a lovely kick in the face I'd give you. I thought you were going to cut it, not pull it out. That's what it feels like." But in spite of the semi-darkness and cold fingers, all was done in the end. The big packs bound on the horses, the rope halters, which they were now wearing instead of bridles and reins, in the children's hands, and the journey began. "Remember," said Bree, "keep together if we possibly can. If not, meet at the temple of the ancient kings, and whoever gets there first must wait for the others." "And remember," said Shasta, "don't you 2 horses forget yourselves and start talking, whatever happens." And that's the end of that chapter. And we're going to call this a calling point for tonight. Thank you all peeps for joining us in. We will continue the story next Sunday. We are not going to be rating anybody, just in case any of our listeners are asleep. I don't want to risk loud noises. So I hope all of you have a wonderful evening and have a great Christmas, in case you don't tune in next week.
Bye bye.